The conference room smelled faintly of burnt coffee and printer toner when my manager slid the paper across the table and calmly told me my bonus wasn't going through. I nodded like it was nothing. What he didn't notice was the quiet message already sent to legal and the single clause in Appendix C that could change everything. Morning light spilled across the glass walls of the office like diluted gold, soft and harmless, at least on the surface. Inside the conference room, however, the air felt heavier than it should have for 8:30 on a Tuesday. Someone had brewed coffee strong enough to wake the entire building, yet the scent of it mixed strangely with printer toner and the faint metallic chill of the air conditioning. My manager, Daniel Harrow, sat across from me with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed every outcome in this building eventually bent his way. He tapped the edge of a document with his pen. "Your bonus isn't going through," he said, almost casually. "New policy." The sentence landed softly, too softly. Around us, the conference room looked perfectly ordinary. Polished table, muted gray chairs, a screen displaying last quarter's sales numbers frozen mid-slide. Outside the glass walls, employees walked past carrying laptops and coffee cups, unaware that a very quiet storm had just started brewing. I nodded, not dramatically, not defensively, just a small, calm nod. Daniel seemed satisfied with that. "You understand," he continued, leaning back. "Budget adjustments, leadership decision." Leadership decision? The phrase floated in the air like a polite lie wearing a well-tailored suit. I folded my hands on the table. "Of course." For a moment, Daniel studied me. Maybe he expected frustration, maybe questions. Most people did, when months of performance targets suddenly dissolved into a sentence about policy. But I didn't argue, and that, strangely, seemed to relax him. "Good," he said. "I knew you'd be reasonable about it." Outside the room, someone laughed near the printers. A keyboard clacked rapidly. The ordinary rhythm of office life continued, steady and oblivious. Inside the room, something quieter was unfolding. Daniel pushed the paper slightly closer to me. "HR will update the compensation structure next week." The paper itself was unimpressive. A short internal memo, vague wording, the kind of document designed to look official without actually promising anything. I glanced at it briefly, then I nodded again. Daniel smiled, the relieved smile of a man who believed the conversation had already ended in his favor. But a small detail escaped him. While he had been speaking, my phone, resting face down beside my notebook, had vibrated once, just once, a short confirmation. "Legal received your request." I hadn't moved, I hadn't checked it, but I knew exactly what the message meant. 2 floors below us, the legal department had just opened a file. Daniel continued talking about future opportunities and team alignment. Words flowed easily from him, polished and confident. I let him speak. Every now and then I gave another quiet nod, the kind that encourages someone to keep explaining themselves, because people reveal the most when they believe the conversation is already over. Outside the window, clouds drifted slowly across the pale sky. Inside, Daniel leaned forward slightly. "I'm glad we're on the same page," he said. Same page. The phrase almost made me smile, because technically, we weren't even reading the same document. What Daniel didn't know, what he couldn't see from his side of the table, was that my employment contract was unusually detailed. It had been reviewed line by line the year I joined the company, a precaution recommended by a former mentor who believed that clarity in contracts prevents very expensive surprises. At the time, it had felt excessive. Now, sitting in that quiet conference room, it felt like foresight. Daniel gathered the memo back toward himself. "Well," he said, standing slightly, "that's everything." For a moment I remained seated, watching the faint reflection of fluorescent lights on the polished table. Then I spoke. "Daniel?" He paused. "Yes?" My tone stayed calm, almost conversational. "Could you clarify something about the policy change?" His expression shifted slightly, half curiosity, half mild annoyance. "What exactly?" I slid a folder from my bag and placed it gently on the table. Not aggressively, just deliberately. Inside that folder was a copy of my employment contract, a small yellow tab marked one particular section. Appendix C. Daniel's eyes moved briefly to the tab, then back to me. For the first time that morning, the room felt a little quieter. "Just a quick clarification," I said lightly. Because somewhere below us, in a much quieter office, legal had already started reading. And if they reached the same paragraph I had in mind, this meeting might not end the way Daniel expected. Somewhere in the building, an email notification chimed. Daniel didn't notice, but in a few minutes, he would. And when he did, the calm confidence on his face might start to fade. Because Appendix C was not the kind of clause companies liked to revisit once a conversation had already begun. Especially not today. Especially not in this room. And Daniel had absolutely no idea what was written in it. Daniel didn't sit back down. Instead, he remained half standing beside the table, one hand resting on the chair as if the meeting had already concluded, and the rest of this conversation was merely a polite delay. The sunlight from the glass wall caught the edge of the yellow tab sticking from my folder. Appendix C. Such a small label for something capable of making a room very quiet. "What clarification?" Daniel asked. His voice still carried the same managerial calm, but the rhythm had shifted slightly, just enough that someone paying attention could hear it. I turned the folder toward him and opened it. The contract pages were smooth, the paper slightly thicker than standard office printouts. When I joined the company 2 years earlier, legal had insisted on preparing executive contracts on heavier stock. Something about archival clarity. At the time, I had thought it was an unnecessary detail. Now the pages felt reassuringly solid. "Just this section," I said, sliding the document closer. Daniel glanced down, scanning the heading. Appendix C, Performance Compensation Guarantee. His eyes flicked across the lines quickly, the way executives often read documents, skimming, confident they already understood the structure. Then he slowed. The silence stretched a little longer. Outside the conference room, someone rolled a chair down the hallway, the wheels humming softly across the polished floor. The ordinary sounds of the office suddenly felt louder. Daniel cleared his throat. "That appendix refers to the previous bonus structure," he said, "before the policy update." His tone had regained some of its firmness. I nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I wanted to confirm." He looked up again. "Confirm what?" I tapped the page gently. "Whether the update formally amends Appendix C." Daniel's brow creased slightly. "It applies company-wide." That wasn't exactly my question. A pause. The faint hum of the building's ventilation system filled the room like a distant tide. Daniel sat down again, slower this time. "Let me see that," he said. I slid the contract fully across the table. He leaned forward, scanning the paragraph again, more carefully now. The wording wasn't complicated. In fact, it was surprisingly direct. If a guaranteed performance bonus outlined in the primary contract was withheld without a signed amendment agreed upon by both parties, non-payment would trigger liquidated damages equal to double the bonus amount. It had sounded almost dramatic when the lawyer explained it during onboarding. "Companies rarely challenge clauses like this," she had said at the time. "It's simpler to honor the original agreement." Back then, I assumed the clause would never matter. Daniel's finger stopped moving along the text. The room became very still. "Where did you get this copy?" he asked. "From my contract." "I mean this version. The signed version HR sent after onboarding." Daniel leaned back slightly, staring at the page as though the words might rearrange themselves if he looked long enough. For the first time since the meeting started, the confidence in his posture seemed less certain. "That clause only applies if the bonus is formally guaranteed," he said. "It is." "No, it's performance-based." "Yes," Daniel frowned. "Yes? Yes," I said calmly. "Performance-based, which means once the targets are met, the payment becomes contractually guaranteed." He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again. Outside the glass wall, 2 analysts walked past carrying a stack of reports. One of them gestured animatedly while speaking, completely unaware of the quiet shift happening inside the conference room. Daniel picked up the contract again. He read the paragraph a second time, then a third. Each pass took slightly longer than the last. "What targets are you referring to?" he asked. I reached into my bag and placed another document beside the contract. The quarterly performance report, signed, approved, and stamped by the same department that had drafted Appendix C. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You exceeded the targets," he said slowly. "Yes. That doesn't automatically—" His phone vibrated on the table. A short buzz, then another. He glanced at the screen. "Legal department." The color drained from his expression so subtly that someone distracted might have missed it. But I wasn't distracted. He answered the call. "Yes?" A brief pause. His eyes moved from the phone to the contract, then back to me. "I'm in a meeting," he said. Another pause. Longer this time. "Appendix. What?" His shoulders stiffened. I watched quietly as the last pieces of the puzzle began sliding into place. Daniel listened without speaking. The confident manager who had entered the room 15 minutes earlier was now staring at the same document with a very different expression. When he finally lowered the phone, the air in the conference room felt noticeably heavier. "What exactly did you send them?" he asked. "Just the contract," I said. And a question." Daniel's voice dropped. "What question?" I closed the folder gently. "Whether a company policy can override a signed employment contract without a written amendment." Another silence. Somewhere down the hallway, a printer started running, page after page sliding out in quick mechanical bursts. Daniel rubbed his temple. "They're reviewing it now," he muttered. "Yes." He looked back at Appendix C, then at the performance report, then at me. The calm certainty he carried into the room had faded into something else entirely. Uncertainty. Because somewhere downstairs, a legal team was currently reading the exact same paragraph, and once they finished, the numbers attached to that clause might become very real. Daniel swallowed. "How much was the bonus again?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer, not yet, because the real conversation was about to start somewhere else, and when legal finished their review, this quiet conference room might become the most expensive place in the building. Daniel didn't know it yet, but the email confirming their interpretation was already being drafted, and when it arrived, the policy he mentioned so confidently earlier would suddenly look very small next to Appendix C, very small, especially when the words "double damages" appeared in bold. Daniel stared at the contract one more time. The color had completely left his face, and the message from legal hadn't even arrived yet. If this meeting made you curious about what happens when contracts speak louder than policies, tell me in the comments. Would you have checked Appendix C too? Subscribe if you enjoy stories where calm decisions and quiet paperwork turn the entire game around. And if you've ever seen a moment in an office when everything suddenly shifted, share it below. The email arrived 6 minutes later, not immediately, not dramatically. Just a soft chime from Daniel's laptop that seemed far too small for the weight it carried. He glanced at the screen automatically, the way people do when they expect routine updates, calendar reminders, budget notes, another meeting request. But the moment his eyes focused on the sender line, his shoulders stiffened. Legal review. The subject line was even shorter. Appendix C, contract clarification. The conference room had grown unusually quiet. Outside the glass walls, the office hummed along with its usual rhythm. Footsteps on polished floors, the murmur of conversations, the steady tapping of keyboards, the normal sounds of productivity. Inside our room, time seemed to slow slightly. Daniel opened the email. His eyes moved across the screen once, then again. The change in his posture was subtle but unmistakable. His back, which had been leaning confidently against the chair, straightened. His jaw tightened. He read the message a third time. I didn't interrupt. The room smelled faintly of cooling coffee and freshly printed paper. Somewhere down the hallway, someone laughed, the sound bright and careless. Daniel exhaled slowly. "What exactly did you ask them?" he said, without looking up. "Only whether the contract still applies," I replied. His lips pressed together. "Well," he said quietly, "they've answered." He turned the laptop slightly so I could see the screen. The message itself wasn't long. Legal departments rarely waste words when precision matters. They confirmed that Appendix C remained valid unless formally amended by a signed agreement between both parties. They also confirmed something else. If the guaranteed performance bonus outlined in the contract was not paid as written, the clause regarding liquidated damages would apply. Exactly as written. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the movement slower now, heavier. That clause was never supposed to become relevant, he said. His voice carried a strange mixture of frustration and disbelief, like someone discovering a safety mechanism they had forgotten existed. I folded my hands calmly. "The targets were met," I said. "Yes. And the contract hasn't been amended." "No." Outside the glass wall, 2 managers passed by discussing quarterly projections. One of them gestured animatedly with a tablet in hand. Their conversation floated faintly through the hallway, completely unaware of the quiet financial equation unfolding here. Daniel stared at the contract again. Then he opened a spreadsheet on his laptop. Numbers began appearing on the screen as he typed. Bonus amount, performance multiplier, liquidated damages clause. The calculations didn't take long. But when Daniel finished, he didn't speak right away. Instead, he stared at the final number. For a brief moment, the fluorescent lights above us hummed loudly in the silence. "That's double," he said slowly. "Yes?" Another pause stretched across the room. Daniel rubbed the bridge of his nose, then closed the spreadsheet as if shutting the window might somehow shrink the figure inside it. "I'm guessing legal already noticed that part." "They tend to read carefully." A faint trace of irony slipped into my voice, but it remained gentle, calm, the tone of someone discussing logistics rather than confrontation. Daniel leaned forward again, elbows resting on the table. "You could have raised this earlier. I assumed the contract already covered it." He let out a quiet breath. The confidence he carried into the room earlier had completely dissolved now. In its place was something much more cautious. He picked up his phone and typed a short message. Another minute passed, then his phone buzzed again. A reply. Daniel read it silently. His expression shifted once more. This time, not with shock, but with reluctant understanding. "Finance is asking for confirmation," he said. "From legal?" "Yes." "And?" Daniel looked up. "They're already sending it." The weight of that sentence settled into the room like a quiet verdict. Outside the window, clouds drifted slowly across the pale sky, casting soft moving shadows across the office floor. People continued their work, unaware that a single contract clause had just rewritten part of the company's morning budget. Daniel tapped the table lightly with his fingers. "This isn't exactly how leadership expected the policy change to work," he admitted. "I imagine not." Another long pause. Finally, he closed the contract folder and slid it back toward me. "You know," he said, his voice calmer now, "most employees wouldn't have noticed something like Appendix C. Most employees trust policy memos more than contracts." He nodded once. "That may change after today." The laptop chimed again. Another email from legal, this time marked "formal confirmation." Daniel didn't open it immediately. Instead, he looked at the glass wall of the conference room, watching employees walk past without slowing down. The ordinary flow of the office continued. Presentations, deadlines, meetings stacked neatly across calendars. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet something important had quietly shifted. Because once a clause like Appendix C proves itself once, people tend to remember it. Daniel finally opened the message. He read it carefully. Then he closed the laptop. The room remained silent for a moment. "Well," he said, standing slowly, "I suppose we'll need to process the payment." He paused, then added with a faint, tired smile, "and update a few policies." I gathered my folder calmly. The sunlight had moved slightly across the table now, illuminating the yellow tab marking Appendix C like a small flag planted firmly in the middle of the page. Daniel noticed it too. For a moment, he studied that tiny piece of paper as if it had personally betrayed him. But contracts don't betray anyone. They simply remember what people agreed to. And sometimes, they remember it at exactly the right moment. By early afternoon, the conference room meeting had already dissolved into quiet ripples moving through the building. Not loud rumors, not dramatic confrontations. Just the subtle shift that happens when information begins traveling the invisible channels of an office. Someone from finance walked a little faster than usual toward the executive wing. A legal assistant appeared briefly at Daniel's door carrying a printed document. Two HR managers held a conversation near the elevators, in voices slightly lower than normal. Nothing obvious, but something had clearly changed. I returned to my desk overlooking the west side of the city, where pale sunlight bounced off neighboring glass towers and scattered across the rows of monitors on the floor below. The office floor smelled faintly of citrus cleaning spray and fresh paper. Someone had recently restocked the printers again. For a while, everything looked exactly as it always did. Emails arrived, reports needed approval. A junior analyst stopped by with a question about next quarter's projections. Work continued, and yet, every now and then, someone would glance in my direction just a little longer than usual. The story was already moving. Not because anyone announced it, but because offices have their own quiet communication systems. Conversations near coffee machines, short messages sent between departments, a raised eyebrow in a hallway. Around 2:30, an email arrived from finance. Subject: Compensation Adjustment Confirmation. The message was polite, structured, professional. They confirmed that the bonus payment outlined in my employment contract would be processed according to the original agreement. And, in accordance with Appendix C, the liquidated damages clause would also be honored. The final amount appeared at the bottom of the message, a number large enough that finance had likely needed approval from several desks before writing it down. I read the email once, then closed it. The satisfaction wasn't loud or dramatic. It felt more like the steady calm after a storm that never quite reached the surface. Across the floor, the murmur of office life continued. Two co-workers debated spreadsheet formulas near the whiteboard. Someone laughed quietly during a phone call. The printer hummed again, releasing page after page of reports. At 3 o'clock, Daniel stepped out of the executive corridor. His walk was slower now, not defeated, just measured. He paused briefly near the glass railing overlooking the lower floor, scanning the office as if noticing details he had previously ignored. The clusters of desks, the steady rhythm of employees working through the afternoon. Then his gaze landed on me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He approached my desk calmly. "I assume finance contacted you," he said. "They did." Daniel nodded once. "The payment will be included in the next cycle." His voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had already had several conversations he hadn't planned on having that morning. "I appreciate the confirmation," I said. Another pause. Daniel glanced briefly at the screens around my desk displaying performance dashboards. "You know," he said quietly, "legal mentioned something interesting during the review." I looked up. They said Appendix C was written unusually clearly. A small smile formed at the corner of my mouth. "They're good at their job." Daniel exhaled faintly. "Yes," he said, "they are." Behind him, two members of the leadership team passed by in the hallway, speaking in low voices. One of them glanced in our direction, before continuing toward the boardroom. Daniel noticed the ripple had clearly reached the upper floor. He straightened slightly. "Well," he said, adjusting the cuff of his jacket, "I suppose this will make our next policy meeting more detailed." "Probably." For a moment, neither of us moved. The office lights reflected softly on the glass partitions around us, creating faint mirrored layers of desks, monitors, and people moving through their afternoon routines. Daniel looked at my desk one more time. Then his eyes briefly settled on the folder beside my keyboard. The yellow tab marking Appendix C was still visible, just a small strip of paper. And yet it had quietly redirected the course of an entire conversation, and possibly a few company policies along with it. Daniel gave a short nod. "Well played," he said, not sarcastic, not bitter, just factual. Then he turned and walked back toward the executive offices. As he disappeared around the corner, the office slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Keyboards clicking, phones ringing, meetings continuing behind glass doors. But somewhere in the building, several departments were already reviewing something they hadn't thought about very carefully before today. Employment contracts, appendices, clauses that most people never read until the moment they matter. And now, because of one quiet meeting in a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner, they mattered a lot more. Sledische glava. Late afternoon settled over the office like a slow exhale. The sunlight had shifted from bright white to a softer amber, stretching long reflections across the glass partitions. Screens dimmed slightly as employees leaned back in their chairs, rubbing tired eyes or reaching for the last cups of coffee that never tasted quite as good after 4 o'clock. Yet the building felt attentive, not tense, just alert. The kind of quiet awareness that spreads through a company when something unusual has happened, even if no official announcement was ever made. I noticed it in small ways. 2 analysts near the window lowered their voices when my name surfaced briefly in their conversation. Someone from HR walked past my desk twice in 10 minutes, pretending to check messages on her phone. Even the receptionist on the lower floor looked up a little longer than usual when I passed earlier. The story had moved farther than I expected. Not exaggerated, not distorted, just circulating. Because offices love a story where paperwork wins. Around 4:15, another message appeared in my inbox. This one wasn't from finance. It came from legal. Subject: Contract Documentation Archive. The message itself was brief. They confirmed that the review had been finalized and the case, if it could even be called that, had been archived as resolved. A scanned confirmation document was attached below. Formal language, clean conclusions, but one line stood out. We recommend maintaining the original contract structure for future reference. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Legal departments rarely write recommendations unless they expect someone important to read them later. And in most companies, recommendations from legal travel upward, not downward. Across the room, a group of junior associates gathered around a large monitor reviewing presentation slides. One of them accidentally knocked over a pen holder, scattering pens across the desk. Laughter followed. Normal office chaos, the kind that fills a workplace when real tension has already passed. My phone buzzed softly. A short message from finance. Payment scheduled. 2 words. Efficient. Final. I set the phone down and watched the reflection of the office lights ripple faintly across the glass wall beside my desk. Some victories arrive loudly. Announcements, applause, dramatic confrontations. This one arrived like paperwork sliding quietly across a desk. No speeches, no raised voices, just signatures, clauses, and a contract doing exactly what it was written to do. Around 5 o'clock, Daniel appeared again on the floor. This time he wasn't walking toward a meeting. He moved slowly between rows of desks, occasionally stopping to exchange short words with department leads finishing their workday. When he reached my desk, he paused. "Long day," he said. "Yes." He glanced briefly around the office. The building had begun its evening transformation, lights softening, conversations becoming lighter, people packing laptops into bags. "You know what legal told me this afternoon?" he said. I raised an eyebrow slightly. "They said the clause in Appendix C has been sitting in several executive contracts for years. That doesn't surprise me." Daniel crossed his arms thoughtfully. "But no one ever triggered it." A faint smile touched the corner of my mouth. "Until today." He nodded. "Yes, until today." For a moment he studied the quiet office floor, the steady hum of a company winding down after a long workday. Then he gave a small, almost amused shake of his head. "All this," he said, "because someone actually read the contract. Reading helps." Daniel laughed softly. Not the confident laugh from the conference room that morning. This one sounded more genuine. "Apparently it does." He straightened his jacket. "Well," he said, glancing towards the elevator lobby, "leadership has a policy meeting tomorrow morning. That should be interesting. I imagine Appendix C will make a brief appearance." Our eyes met for a second. There was no hostility there anymore. Just a quiet recognition that the situation had unfolded exactly according to the rules both sides had agreed to long ago. Daniel nodded once. "Enjoy your evening," he said. "You too." He turned and walked toward the elevators, his silhouette briefly framed by the golden glow of the setting sun pouring through the far windows. When the elevator doors closed behind him, the office grew quieter. Chairs rolled back, lights dimmed, the last emails of the day were sent. I packed my laptop slowly, sliding the familiar folder back into my bag. The yellow tab marking Appendix C peeked out from the pages like a tiny bookmark in a very expensive chapter of company history. And somewhere upstairs, executives were already preparing tomorrow's meeting agenda. Because after today, one small clause buried in a contract had become impossible to ignore. Evening in the building arrived quietly, like the last page of a long document sliding into place. The office lights softened into a warm glow, reflecting off glass walls and polished desks. Most of the day's urgency had already faded. Conversations were lighter now, laptops closed with quiet clicks. Somewhere near the elevators, someone joked about deadlines that could wait until tomorrow. But certain things from today wouldn't simply disappear overnight. I walked slowly through the nearly empty corridor toward the exit, the folder resting calmly in my bag. The same folder that had sat on the conference table that morning. The same small yellow tab marking Appendix C. It was strange how something so small could travel so far in a single day. Near the lobby, 2 employees stood beside the coffee machine, speaking in lowered voices. "Double damages? I heard legal confirmed it." "No way." Their conversation stopped the moment they noticed me walking past. They smiled politely. Professional, careful. Office rumors rarely need microphones. They move through glances, pauses, half-finished sentences. By the time I reached the elevator, the entire building seemed to have absorbed the lesson. Contracts matter, especially the parts people assume will never matter. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Inside, the mirrored walls reflected the quiet end of the workday. People holding laptops, tired but satisfied faces, someone scrolling through emails one last time before leaving. When the doors closed, the building slowly began sliding upward behind the glass reflection. Floor by floor, finance, HR, legal. When the elevator passed the legal department, I noticed the lights were still on inside their office suite. A few silhouettes moved behind the frosted glass walls, likely finishing the documentation from earlier. Legal departments rarely rush, but they remember everything. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, the sky outside had turned deep orange, the city reflecting the last light of the day like molten glass. I stepped outside. The cool air felt different after the quiet hum of the office. Cars moved slowly through evening traffic, and somewhere nearby a street musician played a soft melody that drifted across the sidewalk. For the first time all day, the tension was completely gone. Not because anyone had won, but because the contract had simply done its job. Across the street, the glass tower of the office reflected the sunset like a calm mirror. Hundreds of windows glowing softly as employees finished their workday. Tomorrow the company would keep running, meetings would continue, policies would be reviewed, and somewhere in those meetings, someone would almost certainly mention Appendix C again. Because once a clause proves it matters, people start reading much more carefully. I adjusted the strap of my bag and walked toward the corner. Inside the folder, the contract rested quietly between its pages. No drama, no revenge, just words that had been written long ago, finally doing exactly what they promised. And somewhere upstairs, Daniel was probably preparing for tomorrow's leadership meeting. A meeting where one uncomfortable detail would be impossible to ignore. Not the bonus, not even the damages, but the simple fact that someone had read the contract more carefully than expected. Sometimes the most powerful move in an office isn't raising your voice. It's opening the right page and letting the words speak for themselves.